Thank you, everyone, for attending this session. I know that there's other options out there. I believe Dave Frankfurter is speaking right now, who I've known for about 2 decades, and I probably would be in his session. But I'm glad that you all chose this one. This material is many, probably 2 or 3 semesters worth of coursework crammed into what I'm going to do in about 4.5 hours, or 1 hour. I guess it's 1 hour. So we're going to brief. It keeps everyone awake. But the idea is to just kind of skim the surface of everything. I'm not going to drill too much into each individual slide. I just want to give kind of the start to finish perspective on overall HTM financial concerns, and hopefully it'll just kind of maybe get you thinking about things more holistically as opposed to just dealing with these issues as they come up. So this is kind of a hodgepodge of different topics from different courses that I work with. I pieced it together, so I'm kind of winging it a little bit as far as going through this material. So if I get off on a tangent, forgive me. I'll get back on track, I promise. Just really briefly, just to give you guys an idea of what my perspective is. I've been in the industry for almost 20 years, I can say that now. I started off, I graduated with an electrical engineering degree, so I had more of a technical start. I worked for GE for a number of months staging mobile MRI systems. And then I ended up moving into Columbia St. Mary's, which is an Ascension hospital system here in the area. And for about 4 years, I was a service engineer for imaging equipment. Then I went back to school. I started a program that's offered by Marquette in the Medical College of Wisconsin. It's a master's in healthcare technologies management. And during that time, I had the opportunity to step into a leadership role in the Milwaukee market for, it was Ascension Trimedics at the time, and still is. Did that for about 4 years. I spent 2 years, so that was kind of an ISO in-house hybrid kind of situation. Then for about 2 years, I went to Universal Hospital Services, which is now Agility. And I had more of a regional program management responsibility. So that was more of a true kind of ISO situation. So that gave me a little bit different perspective on kind of financials. Well, the last 9 years, actually 9.25 years, I just looked it up yesterday. I've been at Froedtert in the Medical College of Wisconsin, and I'm the HTM director there. And there are some people from Froedtert in the room, and I did not force them to come here, contrary to Michael's belief. And so that is a true in-house kind of model as well. And whether it's an ISO independent service organization, kind of the hybrid type models, or an in-house model, there are different flavors of all of those different organizations. I'm going to try to keep these concepts as broad as I can. So not everything that I present or talk about or suggest is necessarily something that I'm doing now or that I've done in other roles. This is just more of a kind of a global perspective. So with that, we'll start in the best place to start, which is the beginning. So if you can't see the graphic from way back in the back of the tunnel, this is just a very good representation of HTM finance, even though it's not HTM. It's very easy to use cars, vehicles, automobiles as an analogy for HTM finance. So I'll probably bring this up a number of times throughout this presentation. But just, everybody is familiar with a car. So you have upfront costs to actually purchase to acquire that vehicle, and then there's costs associated with kind of the normal upkeep and maintenance of that vehicle. And there's some discussion around, there's the value question of if once I drive that car off the lot, it starts to lose value over time. So people are familiar with cars, so it's a good illustration of some of the things that we're going to go through here. All right, so let's start off with the complexity. HTM, really by definition, is a multidisciplinary industry. It's not just technical. It is also financial and business, and there's safety and compliance, and there's supply chain. It is truly a multidisciplinary industry. We're going to talk about just the financial pieces of it, with the understanding that it fits into a very complex web of information. So the more we can learn about all these different corners of HTM, the better overall understanding we have of how these all fit together. I like to try to strip things down to the most simplest form. I'm kind of refer to it as a lumper. I like to take lots of things and lump it into digestible chunks. Just in general, for an HTM program, you want to have a clear picture of your inventory of all of the assets that you're managing. You want to have all that under one program, and whether that's a financial program or a compliance program, it's just one full comprehensive program, and you want to have one budget scheme for that. So you want this all to match up. If these are out of balance, if they don't represent each other, then you're going to get into confusion, and it becomes very difficult to keep track. We are going to focus on more on the right side, which is the one budget section. And the diagram that we're going to check in with throughout this presentation is this one. So it's revenue or income minus operational expense is subtraction. No, it's margin. And then we're going to talk about how that fits into capital expenses. We are going to start off the majority of the first half of this section on expenses and identifying kind of the differences of various expenses. I'm going to pop up a few questions along the way just to kind of get your brain thinking about maybe your situation. Are you ever confused about operational budgets versus capital budgets? I get confused, and I feel like I have a pretty good handle on the definitions. Sometimes there's just these variations, but what I want to do is just kind of play around with that a little bit as we talk through here. So that's our first topic, expenses. And we're going to talk specifically capital and operational expenses. So from an HTM perspective, if I was doing an interactive seminar, but I don't want you guys to be yelling through your masks because it'll all just be a bunch of mumbles, you could probably rattle off very easily all the expenses that are associated with an HTM program, whether it's purchasing equipment, supporting the support and maintenance, staffing, infrastructure costs. There are also potentially, if you kind of broaden it, there might be clinical costs such as staffing and pharmaceuticals and medical supplies associated with using the technology. And then within a healthcare setting, or even more so in an industry setting, you might have research, development, investment costs as well. But before we get too far into expenses, there's a couple definitions that we need to handle. I try not to dwell too much on definitions, so bear with these couple here. So first definition is an asset. This isn't like a formal definition. This is just my simple brain thinking of a way to describe what an asset is. So here are the three criteria. You own it, you control it, and it has some sort of value over time. So a car, you own it, you control it, it has value over time. A house would be an asset because you own it, you control it, it has value over time. A napkin, you might own it and control it, but it really doesn't have any value, so that a napkin wouldn't be necessarily considered an asset. When we talk about a capital asset, it's really kind of a subcategory under asset. A capital asset is those same things. You own it, control it, has value over time, but usually it meets some sort of a dollar threshold. So Many organizations will use like $5,000 or $10,000. So even though something under that is technically an asset, they may not consider it an asset because they don't want to do all the administrative tracking that are associated with it. So a capital asset would meet a certain threshold, and usually it has that value over a longer period of life. So if you buy something that's a huge expense, maybe it's some multi-$1,000 filter for some industrial filtration unit in your hospital, yeah, it might be something you own and control and meets the threshold, but really it doesn't have, you might go through that in a year and it doesn't retain value over a long period of time. So the distinction can depend on the organization and the accounting schemes that are used. And we'll kind of play around with this as we walk through as well. So I mentioned a house. Here are some expenses associated with a house. You have to buy appliances. You might add a bathroom in a house. You might remodel a kitchen. You have utility expenses. You have maintenance expenses. You have lawn care expenses. If you think about appliances, you own and control those, and they kind of have value over time. I mean, you can take a refrigerator and sell it on the internet after a while and still get something for that. If you add a bathroom, you're going to add value to your home. So that really is something you own and control, that bathroom, and it's adding value to your home. So that's a kind of a capital asset. Remodeling a kitchen, same way. But utilities, you're paying for it, but you're not getting anything out of it. It's more of a service or a consumable. Maintenance and lawn care, same way. So capital, meaning like that subset of assets, capital expenses are usually investments in the business to add value to that business, and they're usually non-routine. It's not something you're doing on a regular basis. It's more non-routine. Whereas operational expenses is just the cost of doing business. So those are the more routine expenses. So going back to the house analogy, the items that were kind of those capital assets are those capital expenses, and the other items would be operational expenses. Does that make sense? So now let's look at HTM expenses, because that's why we're here. From a capital perspective, it would be purchasing equipment. It could involve transportation and implementation expenses as well. It may not just be that acquisition cost, it's the cost of actually the total cost of acquiring that piece of equipment, that device. Operational costs obviously could be service and maintenance expenses, consumables, supplies, training expenses. Those are not costs that are that have value that you own and control over time. They're just operational costs. Just a little side note. Normally on the other screen you have the little cue of what slide is coming next. That one's just a mirror of that, so I have no idea what the next slide is. So this is just like an exciting adventure for all of us. All right, so software and applications. So this is kind of I wanted to throw this in because this is one of those topics that is always confusing. And even once you understand it, there's always scenarios where it doesn't always quite make sense. But this is talking about software and applications. We all know that medical devices deal a lot with software and applications. So hopefully this will help a little bit. Capital expenses. The definitions can vary depending on who's using, but I consider software upgrades like moving to new functionality or extending the life of a system. So it'd be like if you're moving from kind of like moving from one Windows platform to another Windows platform, or a version 10 to a version 11, whatever that software might be. It's kind of almost like a new product. Since you're extending the life of that device by increasing that or upgrading that application. That could be increasing the value. So you're increasing the life and you're increasing the value, so that could be considered a capital expense. From a licensing perspective, if you're buying a license, so you own that license, so you pay the money, now you own the license, you don't have to pay for it again, you own it. That could be, if it meets all your thresholds for like amount and everything, that could be a capital expense. So even though it's not a thing, it's a license, but it does have value to it. Then where we go to operational, software updates, what I'm referring to here, are more like patches, fixes, just minor tweaks to the existing platform. So it's maybe moving from a version 10 to a 10.1, or it's just adding a Windows service pack or something like that. That's really just more maintenance. It's not really, I mean, you could argue that it's extending the life, but really it's just maintaining that, that software package. So that's an operational expense. This is where it gets a little confusing is, here I said licensing can be capital if you buy it and you own it. Here, licensing, if you're paying per use, so the more I use it, the more I pay, or I'm paying per unit, and I'm just paying, you know, per user or per whatever the unit might be. If I'm not buying a license and owning it, that may be operational. If I am buying a license and I am owning it, but it's below my capital threshold, you could still consider that operational. And that's where sometimes accounting can get a little dicey. But for the most part, if you buy the license and own it, it could be capital if it meets your thresholds versus kind of a reoccurring fee. And I can come back to any of this once we're all done. I'll leave time at the end as well, theoretically. All right, so have you ever wondered why useful life that accounting uses is much shorter than the actual useful life that equipment uses? Sometimes accountants will say in their books, they'll say that it's a 3-year life when it's actually you're going to use it 5 or 7 years. That's because they use the depreciated life as opposed to maybe the actual life of that particular asset. And we'll talk about what that means. So here's a picture of my car in my driveway. Just kidding. That's not my driveway. That's more my car. And that's not actually my car either because I just took the picture off the internet. But that's the car I have. We're going to come back to the automobile in a second, but let's just say, for instance, you're going to buy a car for, say, $20,000. Let's use round numbers. Before we talk about the car, though, let's take a sidestep and just say, okay, if I have that $20,000, if I'm thinking about buying a car, but rather than buy the car, I'm going to hold on to that $20,000, and year after year, I'm going to spend $5,000. And for those of you that don't recognize, those are coins. In ancient times, we used to use those to pay for things. So if I have the $20,000 and I'm going to spend $5,000 year after year, in year one, I'll have $20,000. After year two, I'll have $15,000, $10,000, $5,000. My value of that $20,000 goes down, obviously. So the expense is $5,000 a year. Common sense. Easy to understand. Now here's my car again, or the car that is like my car. I bought the car for $20,000. It loses value. Remember, after you drive it off the lot, it starts to lose value because you're using it over time. So when I first buy it, in the first year, it's $20,000, $15,000, $10,000, $5,000. And you're probably going to say, well, it loses value right when you drive it off the lot. I know, but this is my imaginary world, so we're just going to pretend like for year one, it stays whole. So really, in effect, you have a $5,000 expense. It's no different having $20,000 and spending $5,000 over a year, or having a $20,000 asset and losing that value. It's still an expense over time. And that expense that you're losing is called a depreciation expense. If it gains value, it's called appreciation. So like a home might appreciate value, but for the most from what we're dealing with is depreciation. So here's an example, medical device related. If I buy a high-end display or a tube or a collimator or some sort of power supply that's $10,000, but it's just more of a repair or it's something that's not going to have residual value and I don't consider it really an asset, I basically spend the $10,000 right in year one. I spend it right away, and then I don't have any more expense after that because it's not retaining value and I'm not losing value over time. So that's an operational expense, like we talked about earlier. Now, if I take $10,000 and I buy something, say it's a medical device, a standalone device, I'm going to buy that. I'm going to purchase it for $10,000, but then I'm going to depreciate that value year after year. Say for 10 years, so it'd be $1,000 a year. So that's that depreciation expense over time. So why is depreciation important? I'm asking the question so that I can answer it. Get that? So here's the example. This will show you how depreciation becomes important. If you have an equipment inventory worth $100 million, and let's say your service expenses are $5 million a year, it may be obvious to say that over 10 years, if your service expenses are $5 million a year, you're going to have a $5 million operating expense year after year for those 10 years. Sounds reasonable. But remember, there's additional expense. There's expense associated with owning that capital. There's that depreciation expense. So if you were to assume that $100 million, say the average lifespan of your equipment is 10 years, so you split that $100 million over time, you may have $10 million of depreciation expense year after year. So your overall operating expense of having and owning that equipment, your total cost of that capital may be as much as $15 million. So the point is that it may not, if you're considering adding equipment to your inventory, it may not just be the service expense you need to worry about from an accounting perspective. They also have to take into consideration what the impact of that depreciated expense is on their margin. So it begs the question, are you capturing the full cost of your HTM program? So we talked about expenses, and now we're going to dip into budgets. So what budgets are is a systematic way to plan for and measure your expense performance or your revenue performance, but we're HTM, so we're just kind of a black hole of expense usually. And we're going to talk about two approaches, centralized and decentralized budgets. So we just talked about capital budgets or capital expenses where we acquire the equipment, and there may be some large capital expenses associated with upgrading. In a decentralized expense model, you'll have a clinical department and you'll have maybe some applications training. You might have some, you'll have the depreciation expense that will be spread out over time. You might have a service contract and some time and materials, and over time that balance may change depending on some of the investments you make on your HTM labor or and getting service training and test equipment and whatnot. So that starts to offset some of those expenses. But you can kind of see that some of the expense sits in these clinical departments and some of the expense sits down in the HTM department. And the challenge there is this looks great, but now if I invest in all this training, I'm not just impacting one department, I may be impacting multiple departments. So if I have, for instance, two departments that buy the same piece of equipment, one buys it first, I get some service training, I'm going to take on service for it, and I'm thinking, well, I want all the costs to be in one place, so I'm going to charge my training to that department so that you can see I invested this training, here's how we reduce the service costs, and it's all in one place. Well, now another department department comes along and buys the same equipment. Well, I already charged the training to a different department, so now it's a little lopsided. I'm not capturing the total cost of my program, and I'm not capturing costs in the same place where I can see I invest in this, and this is what came of it. It's all spread out, and it's hard to measure that across. So typically, the easier way to do it without doing fancy accounting is to do more of a centralized approach, where you're capturing your service costs all in one place. And then there's ways that you can allocate and split out some of those costs differently. But that way, it doesn't matter where you're putting that training and where you're spending that labor and how you're divvying up the expenses, because you're capturing it all in one place. Yep.
So the service costs are depreciating over time because you train more staff or have more people.
Correct. Yes. Yep. So the way I kind of did the diagram is to illustrate that. So you have service contracts up front, you have service training, and then over time your labor gets more, your service contracts go down, your time and materials go higher. So that's kind of the service strategy balance. But if you're spreading that out over multiple departments, it's hard to capture that. Good question. You guys see that in the back? I'll let you read it. I'm going to grab a drink. Pause it, internet. So this is actually a pretty true scenario. Sometimes people try to play games to skirt the thresholds so that they can consider something operational as opposed to capital. And this is just making fun. There's nothing educational about that. It's just pure entertainment. All right. So now we're going to get into life cycle planning. So we talked about the different types of expenses, and then we got a little bit more into the budgets, where you put the money. And now let's talk about life cycle planning. So I'm more focusing on those capital assets, and how do we plan for that systematically. I think a lot of people would argue with me when I try to oversimplify capital planning, but I tend to oversimplify it because I feel like as an industry we're tending to overcomplicate it. So I'm trying to oversimplify it to counterset that. When it comes to capital planning, I think there's two major data points that need to be considered. One is, and they're obvious, so this isn't like Bruce chattering, so don't feel like you have to write this down. There's the capital replacement cost, so there's the cost that you're going to have to spend in order to replace that particular asset. And then there's the expected life. So when am I going to have to spend that money? There are other factors. People talk about service and reliability and all those types of things, and those are great planning tools, and that's great information to have. But when you're looking at an overall program spread across multiple years, and you're looking at multiple millions of dollars worth of assets, sometimes we overcomplicate the plan, and it gets too muddy where you start to question the data. And really what you just need to have is, what are the buckets I need to have over a period of time? And when you get into the details of the buckets, that's where some of that extra data might help. But let's walk through this really quickly, and maybe you'll see what I'm saying, and if not, that's fine too. So I consider these the data anchors. These are the anchor points that are must-haves, and I think these are pretty obvious. The number one is the capital replacement cost. This is always tricky because some people want to use the actual price of what I paid for that equipment the first time I bought it. that may not be the price that you use the second time. So that might not be the best to use in your plan. The book value is pretty much never the right cost to use because book value changes. It decreases over time. That is the depreciated value that accounting counts. So if someone gives you the book value of that asset, it's not for capital planning purposes other than to just know that it's been fully depreciated. List price might work, but essentially what you want is the value of that purchase or that asset and maybe some construction integration type costs in order to capture the total cost of acquiring that asset. And then as far as expected life, so remember capital assets have a certain life to them. We want to capture what that life is. We may not want to use the accounting life because usually the accounting life, the depreciated life is short. It's usually shorter than what the actual life is. We always get all confused over, is the end of the life when it's end of support? Is it end of service life? Is it end of production? Is it when the parts are limited? Is it, what does it mean to be end of life? In general, it's what's the end of that useful life, but it's when is that no longer supported? I guess when is it no longer usable would be one thing, but when is it no longer supported is essentially that life that you're looking for. And then those are kind of the primary anchor points. Now, if you want a little bit more detailed in order to, in any given year, to figure out, okay, maybe I have limited dollars and I need to make a decision between two things that are due for replacement, that's when you start to get into some of the supplemental data. So service and reliability. Basically, just use your data, whatever you have. It might be repair frequencies, mean time between failure, whatever those data points might be. Same with utilization. Now, this is something that HTM groups don't typically track in their systems. It's more of a clinical, operational kind of perspective. But if you're considering a life cycle plan, something due for replacement, you got to ask the question, do I even need to replace it? Am I maximizing the utilization on my current assets, or do I really need to replace this? So here's the simple format. You list your assets. These are just accounting units. You have the life expectancy and the cost. This could just be a simple data dump out of your data system. Then you can plug it in an Excel template, or maybe your CMMS just spits this out as it is. But essentially, here's the assets. This is listing the information that was just on the last screen, but now it's sequencing it year over year. So I can see, now don't add up the numbers because I haven't added it here, so there's other stuff, but I can see year over year how much I have to account for each year in my capital plan. And that way the organization can look ahead and say, okay, here's what we need to keep up with. If we don't keep up with this, the cost will snowball year after year. Or if we replace things too early, we're not going to maximize the life of that equipment. Because if we use it past its depreciated life, then we don't have that depreciation expense. If we replace it too early, that depreciation expense just kind of stays there. So the idea is to balance it, use it as long as you reasonably can, but don't overextend because you're going to snowball and not be able to afford your capital plan in the future. All right. Do all medical devices make money? The answer is no. We don't always buy equipment in order to get a return on investment. Sometimes we just need it to provide adequate care for the patients. It sounds obvious, but when you really get into an organization and get through some of these discussions, it doesn't seem to be as obvious as you'd like it to be. So let's talk about revenue really quick. So bringing money in. Here's our little diagram, revenues on the side over here, and that becomes important. I'm not going to dig into these. I'm just going to point out when you're considering purchasing capital equipment, some of the questions that maybe we don't ask from an HTM perspective, but what we might want to do is make sure these questions are asked. Can we bill for this? What will CMS insurance pay? How much can we bill? Is it a market competitive price? This is all about bringing money into the organization. Healthcare reimbursement, what are the CMS rates? What are the contract rates, the self-pay rates? These are questions that you need to ask on the front end to see, what kind of money is going to come in with these, because the justifications that will come from the requesters are going to have some sort of financial analysis, so you have to make sure that they've considered all these various options. Again, the utilization and the volume. So even if we buy this equipment, what is that utilization? Do we actually need it? Can we absorb the volume on our current systems? Do we need as many systems as we currently have? Just because we own it now doesn't mean we have to replace it. We could maybe do without it. So that's kind of the questions about the money coming in and trying to do that calculation. I'm not going to get into that calculation. That's beyond what we're going to talk about today. But the question I'm leading to is, should we fund all capital requests that have substantial quick return on investments? So if I have a ton of revenue, little expenses, does that mean, yes, we should go ahead and buy it? Not always. So let's talk about return on investment. So return on investment, I think we all know, is we have to take into consideration what is that total initial cost. We have to talk about what are those operational costs, those operational expenses we talked about. What are the revenues that we just walked through very briefly? What are other incidental costs that maybe aren't directly related to that equipment that we have to consider? What are costs related to efficiency gains? So if we become more efficient, can we calculate more cost into that, or cost reduction into that? And then are there assumptions and risks involved in our analysis? How sure are we that our calculations are correct and that they're going to actually happen? So from a return on investment perspective, usually we're talking about a break-even point. Is the revenue that we're bringing in minus the expenses, is it going to break even? Are we going to have a return on our initial investment? But you got to remember, all of these capital purchases are competing for the same money. So one bucket of money, and they're all competing for the same money. So even if everything has return on investment for 100%, we still might not have enough to actually purchase it. So you might up your threshold and say, not only do I want a return on investment, but I want 150% return on investment. Because you have to raise your threshold based on what the available funding is. But then here's the piece that usually gets missed. Are the gains sustainable? If I buy a system and I have a return on investment, a full return on investment in 1 year, and it's $1 million system, or even 150% return on investment, does that system provide a certain therapy or treatment to a certain patient population that after that year, I get my money back, but I've treated that patient population and now I don't have any more volume? And now I'm stuck with this piece of equipment that doesn't really have any value to us because we don't have any more patient flow to handle that. So it's not just what's that return on investment, what's that break-even point, it's what is the outlook going forward? Is that system or that acquisition going to be utilized far off into the future? All right, so we talked about expenses, we talked about budgets, we talked about capital planning and having a plan for, what's the systematic approach to replacing capital over time. We talked about the return on investment being part of the decision point. Now let's just briefly go through a kind of hypothetical capital process, just to understand that. So here's our diagram again. Overall, as an organization, you're going to bring in income and revenue. You're going to have expenses and you're going to have margin. It's important to realize that margin in most organizations will fund your capital. It's kind of like in your home. If you pay out all of your regular routine expenses, you're not going to pay for an addition on your house or put in a new bathroom or a kitchen unless you have some sort of margin in your personal finances. It's usually the same case in a healthcare organization unless they have tons of reserves available. But typically, the margin funds the capital. So if you have a year where you break even and you don't have any margin, you may not have any capital for that following year. And most healthcare organizations only work on 3, 4, 5% margin. So it's it's very touchy as to how that funding comes through. So sometimes there's always that, we need to invest in this, we need to keep up with our capital plan. But sometimes if that margin isn't happening, you just don't have the funds available in that capital expense bucket to cover that. So it's not a matter of deciding whether you should or shouldn't, it's whether you can or can't. So this is like a decision matrix. This literally is an entire college course that I teach at Marquette on technology assessment. But it's kind of a decision process about different technologies, whether it's existing technologies in your organization or new technologies. But it's a complex kind of evaluation of how you get from your plan to how you get to kind of an approval of what exactly you're going to move forward. So your plan may have buckets, and let's just hypothetically kind of consider these buckets. Again, this is just kind of a generic example, but let's assume that we have these boxes represent buckets of funding. So we might have a strategic investment bucket. So that's new business planning, building a new facility, mergers and acquisitions. It's like this big strategic stuff that gets handled up in the executive group. Information technology is a huge expense in all organizations. So that's the infrastructure, the storage, data, networks, applications. So that might be its own kind of bucket to balance. Medical equipment is what we're primarily concerned with, the replacement, additional equipment, new types of technologies. There might be other large capital, which would be like renovations and other large projects that would be considered capital. And then there might be some other smaller capital type things, updates and furniture and pictures and that. So here's the scenario. So these are the buckets that I just explained. So consider a hospital with these buckets. Typically, the strategic allocations are just something that's predefined by executive leadership. There usually isn't a capital committee that's walking through those. That's just something that's just right off the top. Your margin's got to fund at least that. Information technology has gotten to become its own, has its own personality and tends to have its own kind of vetting process, just because of the nature of keeping up with IT technology. It's pretty quick turnover. Medical equipment, if we follow that capital plan example that I explained, where we have a systematic way of planning year to year what we're going to replace over time, theoretically that should be pretty programmatic, where you don't really think about it. It's just, okay, here's this due for replacement, I'm going to replace it. And it should be, there shouldn't be a whole lot of vetting along with that. There may be some decision points of something needs to be replaced early because of service issues, or maybe it needs to, we can hang on to it a little longer because of budget issues, but for the most part, you kind of stick to that plan. These threshold, non-threshold, small capital, big capital requests, these are kind of don't fit into those other buckets. These would need to be evaluated based on what available funds there are. So the strategic allocations, the information technology, the medical equipment, those should all be pretty scripted as far as following. And then whatever's left would be vetted through some capital. That's kind of what I just said. So then, as far as you vet everything, you approve based on your funding, there's two schools of thought of how you can release those funds. One is a fixed capital cycle, where you request it, you approve it, and then you release it. So you might have the capital cycle at the beginning of the year. All of a sudden, you say, "Here's all the money. Everybody just go forward and spend it." Or you might have a phased capital cycle where it's more of a dynamic process. It's not an annual budget that you just spend. It's more of a continuous flow of requests and rebalancing. So one is approving prior, this is the fixed capital cycle, approved prior to the capital cycle. Also, every fiscal year you'd approve that budget and you'd release those funds at the beginning. Whereas the phase is you release it, it's more of a dynamic process. And I'll show you a diagram of what that might look like. But you could do something where, because these should be pretty, like I said, pretty scripted. So these might be fixed where it's just like, okay, we know we need to spend this in this particular year, but maybe the items that are a little bit more variable each year, we might do those more on a phased approach. So here's what the diagram might look like. So here's all my requests for a particular year. Here's quarter one of a fiscal year, of a financial year. I may have all these requests, and here's the line. So these requests didn't make it past the line. These are all the things that are going to be funded. These are funded quarter one. When you get to quarter two, you might get some more funding. Quarter three, you get more funding. In quarter four, you get a few more items to wrap up. In the meantime, your queue keeps backfilling. People are coming up with additional requests that need to come into the process. And any requests that are floating around this line, you're rebalancing as you go quarter to quarter. So whatever falls into these buckets might change over time. And that way you're not relying on people to plan a year or a year and a half in advance for a capital process. It's basically as you identify the need, you put it into the plan, and then it gets reprioritized maybe on a quarterly basis. So by the time you spend all this money, these items would then slide up, and that would be your next kind of cycle, and then you'd go forward that way. So it's a continuous input and rebalancing of all the requests. Just two different ways to do it. One is just the fixed for the year. Here's what your budget is, and then this is the kind of the rebalancing approach. So what? So this goes back to where we started. We talked about life cycle planning, capital budget. There's some finance stuff, expense budgets. Service strategies tie into those expense budgets. Expense budgets are influenced by contract management. There's supply chain aspects to it. All of this kind of ties together in a kind of a tangled web, and it's hard to pull out the financial aspects of HTM from the service, the quality, and the technical side of things. You kind of have to look at it from a holistic perspective, whether it's individuals looking at the holistic perspective or groups of people. But this is where it's important in my mind to at least have some sort of basic financial foundations from an HTM perspective in the industry. If you're interested in hearing more about some of these topics, I did start a podcast a year or so ago. Most of the content on there is based on some of these financial concepts. So it goes into some of this in a little bit more detail. I'll probably be posting more in the future. I kind of took a hiatus for a while. It's hard to record podcasts during COVID when your entire family and all your pets and everybody are home, trying to do something in a quiet environment. You don't know how many times in those podcasts, how many times I had to edit out dogs barking at things. But it goes into some of this stuff a little bit more in depth. There's hopefully some entertainment quality to it. So even if you're like, oh, this is a review and I'm not really interested in learning more about it, it might be some entertaining aspects to it. So feel free to check that out.